It was 1 in the morning when the pounding on my front door rattled me awake, a frantic rhythm that didn't sound like any neighbor or friend, more like an alarm set loose in the night. And before I even reached for the lamp on the side table, my pulse was hammering in my ears, the instincts from my years in the police force kicking in automatically. I pushed myself up from the couch where I'd collapsed after a grueling late shift, the smell of stale coffee still clinging to my uniform shirt that I hadn't even bothered to hang, and staggered toward the door, heart pounding, every nerve in my body wired for danger. I shouted, "Who's there?" with a voice that cracked from exhaustion, but carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. And for a moment, there was nothing, only the wind pushing against the old oak trees outside. Then another weaker knock, and a trembling whisper that sliced through me. "Mom, it's me. Please open up." And my knees nearly buckled, because I knew that voice, my daughter Sarah, and I tore the lock open so fast I almost ripped the handle off. She collapsed straight into my arms like a broken doll, her face pale under the harsh porch light, the side of her mouth caked with dried blood, one eye swollen shut, her thin body shaking so hard I thought she'd crumple right there on the threshold. And when I tried to steady her, she whispered between sobs, "He hit me, Mom. He hit me because of her." And I didn't need to ask who he was. My son-in-law, Robert, the man I had once welcomed into our family, the man who stood in a church in Ohio promising to protect my little girl, now reduced to this monster that left her body covered in bruises. I guided her inside, lowering her onto the couch, running to the kitchen for a wet rag and my old first aid kit. But when I pressed the cloth to her lip and gently lifted the hem of her blouse to check her ribs, my breath froze. An ugly black and purple bruise spread across her abdomen, fresh and angry, proof that this wasn't a single slap, but repeated blows meant to hurt, to destroy. And as I traced the swelling with my fingertips, I felt the rage burn through my chest until it was all I could do not to drive straight to Robert's place and end this with my service pistol. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, to think like the cop I had trained myself to be, not the furious mother who wanted blood, and I reached for my phone, dialing the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital across town, telling the night nurse on duty that I was bringing in a domestic violence case and to prep x-rays. Then I called the only cab company still running this late because my own car was in the shop with busted brakes, and while we waited, Sarah clung to me like a child again, whispering apologies for waking me up, for being a burden, and every word was like a knife in my heart because my daughter thought she had to apologize for being beaten, for surviving. When her phone lit up on the coffee table, I saw the missed calls, 7 from Robert, and messages that made my blood boil. Threats dressed up as ultimatums, the kind of intimidation abusers use to keep their grip tight. And when I reached to read them, Sarah panicked, snatching the phone away with a look of sheer terror and begging me not to look, her eyes pleading as though the device itself could explode if I pried too deep. So I held her trembling hand instead and whispered, "You're safe now, baby. He's never going to hurt you again," even as I vowed silently that this would not end here. The cab finally pulled up, headlights flashing against the windows, and I half carried Sarah out, her weight draped over me, her voice weak and breaking as she whispered over and over, "I couldn't take it anymore, Mom. I couldn't," until we slid into the back seat and I gave the driver strict instructions to floor it to the ER. The ride was a blur of neon lights and empty streets, her head resting on my shoulder, my arm wrapped around her small frame, until we arrived at St. Mary's, where the cold glow of fluorescent lights spilled over the entrance, and the on-call physician, Dr. Jennifer Morales, rushed to meet us with 2 nurses, her face stiffening when she saw the condition Sarah was in, her trained eyes scanning the bruises like they were screaming at her, and she motioned us inside without wasting a second. As the nurses gently removed Sarah's jacket and shirt, the sight of fresh marks around her wrists and shoulders made my stomach turn, rope-like bruises that hinted at restraint, and I had to grip the edge of the exam table just to keep from losing it then and there. Jennifer ordered immediate imaging to check for internal bleeding, and as they wheeled Sarah off, I was left pacing the hallway, my badge heavy on my hip. All I could think about was my little girl, and her face turned to a bone-white terror. My fists clenched so tightly that my nails cut into my palms until I finally forced myself down to admissions to sign the paperwork and cover the deposit, my phone buzzing nonstop in my pocket with blocked calls I knew damn well were Robert trying to reach me, trying to weasel his way into control again. But I let each one go unanswered because the only conversation he'd get from me would be through a courtroom or a jail cell. When I returned upstairs, Sarah was half asleep under a blanket, the IV dripping slowly into her arm, her face slack with exhaustion. And I sat there in the chair beside her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, and remembering the little girl she had once been, racing through our backyard in Columbus shouting, "Mom, look at me!" with a smile brighter than the sun. And now here she was, eyes swollen shut, smile stolen by the very man who vowed to love her. And I swore to myself that I would not let this monster break her completely. At dawn, I signed Sarah out against her protests and took her home with strict orders to rest, slipping her under a quilt and heating milk on the stove like I used to when she was sick as a child, then stepping outside to clear my head where I ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, sweeping her porch across the street, who hurried over when she saw my uniform still wrinkled from last night and asked if everything was okay, her eyes wide with concern. And when I told her in clipped words that Sarah had come home beaten by Robert, her expression hardened into something fierce, and she said, "Don't let him get away with it, Mary. You've got to fight for her." And I nodded because I already knew this was a war, not just a fight. When she reminded me she had cameras on her porch, I nearly hugged her, asking if they'd caught anything. And sure enough, she pulled out her phone to show me grainy footage of Sarah stumbling to my door at 1 a.m., pounding weakly with her bruised fists, sobbing. And I recorded it right there into my own phone, knowing it was the first brick in the wall I'd build to crush Robert. By the time I slipped back inside, Sarah was finally asleep, her breath shallow, and I stood in my room staring at my pressed blue police uniform hanging inside the closet, the khaki pants and leather belt with the holster gleaming in the early sunlight, and I dressed piece by piece, each button I fastened a vow, each strap I tightened a silent oath. Not just as a mother, but as a cop, sworn to protect and serve. And when I was done, I called my longtime family lawyer, David Thompson, waking him from his warm bed with 3 sharp words: "David, start the plan." And though his voice came back groggy, he asked if I was ready to declare war, and I answered without hesitation, more certain than I've ever been, before hanging up, grabbing my digital camera and snapping photographs of every wound on Sarah's body while she slept, every swollen lip, every dark bruise, each flash burning not only onto the memory card, but into my mind as fuel. And when I finally sat at the dining table with the laptop open, transferring files, stacking medical records beside the footage from Mrs. Carter's porch, I realized there was no turning back. Robert had crossed a line, and I, Mary Williams, mother, cop, and soldier for justice, was going to make damn sure he paid for every drop of blood, every tear, every sleepless night he had inflicted on my daughter. The following morning, the pale sunlight barely broke through the blinds when I walked into Sarah's room with a tray of soup and cornbread, the steam curling upward like a fragile promise that life could be warm again. But she stirred weakly, shook her head, and muttered she wasn't hungry, her voice a rasp of shame. And I sat on the edge of the bed, coaxing her with a gentleness I hadn't used since she was a child, afraid of thunderstorms, telling her she had to eat, that she needed strength if she was going to get through this. And after a moment, she picked up the spoon with trembling hands and forced a few bites down, each swallow looking like it hurt more than it helped. And I watched with my chest tight, remembering how only a few years earlier, Sarah had been vibrant and full of life, always organizing charity drives, baking pies for church events, her laughter carrying through our home in Columbus like a melody. And now she was this fragile shell, weighed down by bruises and invisible chains that Robert had wrapped around her. And as I sat there, I promised myself that this man would never have the chance to steal her laughter again. By mid-morning, I drove Sarah back to St. Mary's, my gut churning with fear that her abdominal bruising hid more damage than the ER had caught last night. And Dr. Morales ordered a CT scan, her face set in professional concern. And while Sarah lay under the sterile lights of the radiology room, I paced the hall, rubbing my temples until sweat pooled along my hairline, because as a cop, I had seen victims spiral downward fast from internal injuries, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing my daughter, not to the blows, but to delayed treatment. When the results came back showing contusions but no ruptures, I exhaled a breath so heavy it felt like I'd been holding it for years, and I kissed Sarah's forehead as they discharged her with instructions for rest, pain meds, and counseling. We drove home in silence, her eyes closed, my hands gripping the wheel like iron, and when I tucked her in again, I stepped outside to call David, my lawyer, telling him I now had hospital documentation, photos, and Mrs. Carter's video as our first set of evidence. And he said to meet him at his downtown office later that afternoon to begin building the case. Before heading there, I went across the street where Mrs. Carter, bless her soul, greeted me at the door with a crock pot full of chicken stew and a promise to watch Sarah like a hawk while I was gone. And I thanked her so deeply it nearly broke my voice, because in that moment, I realized allies were rare but invaluable in a fight like this. When I arrived at David's office, the late afternoon sun bounced off the glass towers of downtown Columbus, and I parked my old Ford outside his building, carrying a manila folder stuffed with every piece of evidence I'd gathered so far. And inside his mahogany-paneled office, I laid it all on his desk. The photos of Sarah's swollen face and stomach, the hospital charts, the video file from Mrs. Carter's camera, and his brow furrowed deeper with each item he studied until he finally leaned back and said, "Mary, this is already a strong case, but to crush Robert, we need undeniable proof of adultery, too. Judges don't look kindly on men who beat their wives, but when you stack fraud, adultery, and assault, you corner them completely." And his words stung, because I realized this meant I would have to see Robert with my own eyes again, watch him parading around with his mistress while my daughter bled inside. But I nodded firmly because this war wasn't about my comfort. It was about Sarah's survival. That evening, after leaving Sarah under Mrs. Carter's watchful care, I changed out of my uniform into jeans and a hoodie, slipped my camera into my purse, and drove across the city to a bar Robert was rumored to frequent. One of those seedy sports bars on the east side with neon beer signs flickering in the windows and motorcycles lined up outside, the kind of place that smelled of stale smoke and fried wings before you even walked through the door. And I parked down the block, waiting, my stomach tight, until I saw his Dodge Ram pull up around 8 o'clock and him stepping out looking smug. And then a woman appeared in a crimson dress, tall heels clicking against the pavement, her hair teased up and lips painted dark, strutting right into his arms like she belonged there. And I knew, instantly, this was Denise, the mistress Sarah had whispered about through tears. Robert leaned in and kissed her full on the mouth before ushering her inside, his arms snug around her waist. And the sight was gasoline poured onto the fire already raging in me. But I steadied my hands, lifted the camera, and snapped shot after shot. The flash muted, but the images clear. Robert's face against hers, his arm holding her close, the license plate of his truck reflecting under the streetlight. Every photo, a bullet in the chamber of the case I was building. I trailed them from the bar to a cheap roadside motel a few blocks away, documenting every move, every lingering touch, until they disappeared into the lobby hand in hand. And I took one final picture of the glowing motel sign with the digital clock in the corner reading 9:02 p.m., proof of time and place, before driving home with my heart still clawing at my ribs. I barely had time to upload the photos and secure them on an external hard drive before Sarah called for Mrs. Carter's phone, her voice trembling that Robert had reached out to one of her friends, demanding to know where she was, threatening that if he couldn't find her, he'd make sure she regretted it. And the terror in Sarah's words made my blood run cold. But I soothed her as best I could, promising she was safe and that I had eyes on him, though deep inside I knew Robert was getting desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. I called Captain Ross, my old partner and now commander at the precinct, asking him to send patrol cars to circle Mrs. Carter's block at night, explaining only enough to let him know this was urgent. And he agreed, but warned me quietly that going after family could get messy, that Robert had connections in town, and that I needed airtight evidence to make this stick. And I assured him I was gathering exactly that. Back home, I sat at the dining table surrounded by folders, printing copies of every photo and medical record, labeling each one with dates and times. My kitchen transformed into a war room. And I stared at the wall clock tick past midnight, my exhaustion clawing at me, but my determination burning hotter than ever. Because Robert had underestimated me, thinking he could scare Sarah into silence and scare me into passivity. But he forgot who I was. I wasn't just Sarah's mother. I was a cop with 20 years on the force. I knew the system inside out, and I was going to use every ounce of it to bury him legally until there was nothing left of his false bravado but a prison jumpsuit. The next morning, I took Sarah to her first therapy session with a trauma counselor David had recommended, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Elaine Brooks, whose office smelled of lavender and was filled with pastel paintings of rivers and meadows. And as I sat in the waiting room flipping through old magazines, I felt that familiar pang of guilt that I hadn't been able to shield Sarah from this pain, that despite my badge and training, I hadn't stopped Robert's hands before they left marks on my baby. And I clenched my jaw, determined not to fail her again. While she spoke with Dr. Brooks, I received a call from an old contact at the county recorder's office, a man I'd helped years back with a fraud investigation. And his voice was urgent as he told me my name and Sarah's had just appeared on a suspicious deed transfer filed last week, supposedly signing over a piece of land I'd inherited from my father, except I knew damn well neither of us had signed anything. And the bile rose in my throat as he confirmed that Robert himself had dropped off the paperwork, claiming to act on our behalf. His arrogance so brazen he didn't even try to cover his tracks. And when I drove down to the recorder's office later that day, the clerk showed me the file, the forged signatures trembling across the page, my family's legacy stolen on paper. And I took copies, my hands trembling with fury, but my voice steady as I promised the clerk I'd keep his tip confidential. When I picked Sarah up from therapy, she looked drained, but calmer, as if letting some of her pain spill into the quiet of that office had lightened her just a fraction. And I drove her straight to David's with the forged deed in hand, spreading it across his desk like the smoking gun it was. And he whistled low, saying, "Mary, this isn't just abuse. This is grand larceny and fraud. This is enough to lock him away for a long time." And for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, we were turning the tide. By Saturday morning, the air in Columbus was crisp, the kind that hinted at fall coming early, and I bundled Sarah up in a light blue sweater before driving her to stay another night with Mrs. Carter, because no matter how many patrol cars circled our block, I couldn't shake the feeling that Robert might try something reckless if he knew she was under my roof. And Mrs. Carter promised she would not let Sarah out of her sight, even setting up a cot in her own bedroom so Sarah wouldn't be alone. Her voice fierce in a way that made me silently thank God for giving me a neighbor who was more like family. Once Sarah was settled, I returned home, slipped into jeans and a plain jacket, tucked a thick folder of evidence into my bag, and headed for Robert's pawn shop on the east side, the place he used as a front for his shady dealings, the smell of oil and cigarettes hitting me the moment I stepped through the door, where two of his hangers-on lounged against the counter smirking as if they'd been expecting me, one of them muttering, "Well, look who it is, the cop mother-in-law." And I ignored them, walking straight toward the back office where Robert sat behind a scarred oak desk with piles of cash and receipts spread out, his smug grin stretching across his face as he greeted me with mock politeness. "Well, Mary, what a surprise! You slumming it today?" But I didn't waste words. I slapped the folder down on his desk so hard that the papers spilled out. Photos of Sarah's bruised face, hospital reports listing contusions, Mrs. Carter's video showing Sarah pounding on my door at 1 a.m, and the forged deed with signatures that looked nothing like ours. And for a second, I saw Robert's mask slip, his eyes flickering with panic before the smirk returned, and he leaned back in his chair with a laugh, saying, "And what exactly do you think you've got here? Paper? I've got lawyers who eat paper for breakfast." And I met his gaze coldly, answering, "Then I'll see you in court, Robert," before turning to leave. But he shot up from his chair, his face flushed red, and shouted, "You think you can take me down? This whole town is on my side, Mary. You'll be the one disgraced." And his men shifted as if to block my path, until I pulled back my jacket just enough for my badge to glint in the dim light, the weight of my holstered pistol visible on my hip, and they froze, stepping aside as Robert slammed his fists onto the desk and spat. "Your daughter is weak. She deserved to be corrected, and that badge won't protect you forever." His words slicing into me like shards of glass, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply picked up the file, shoved it back into my bag, and told him in an even voice, "The law will deal with you now, not me," before walking out past his cronies, who no longer dared look me in the eye. And outside in the parking lot, the September wind whipped dust across the cracked pavement as I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, forcing myself not to go back inside and end it the old-fashioned way, because I knew justice had to come through the courts, through the system, even if it killed me to wait. That afternoon, David called me to his office again, his tone serious as he handed me fresh papers. Robert had filed a countersuit, claiming Sarah had fabricated the abuse to extort him and that I was abusing my authority as an officer to harass him. And as I read the words, my stomach churned because I knew exactly what his game was, to flip the narrative, to paint Sarah and me as liars in the eyes of the court and the community. And worse, some of the townsfolk were already swallowing his poison. When I stopped by the grocery store later that evening, I caught whispers behind me, neighbors muttering that Sarah was probably exaggerating, or that I was using my badge for revenge. And when I glanced over, I saw women I'd known for years avert their eyes. Ashamed, maybe, or just cowardly. And it was like a knife twisting in my gut. But I held my head high, refusing to let their doubt weaken me, because I knew the truth, and I would drag it into the light. That night back at home, as I organized the files once more, slipping the new countersuit into its own folder, a chill ran through me when I found an unmarked envelope shoved under my front door, and inside was a single sheet of notebook paper scrawled with jagged letters. "Shut up or lose your daughter." And though my hands trembled holding it, it wasn't fear that shook me, but fury. The kind of molten rage that steadies instead of scatters. And I slipped the note into the evidence box, vowing to use even his threats as weapons against him. I met with David again under the dim glow of his desk lamp, sliding the note across to him, and he nodded grimly, saying, "Every step he takes to intimidate you only strengthens our case. But public opinion is still leaning his way. We need a witness from his inner circle, someone who can dismantle his facade from the inside." And instantly, my mind went to Denise, the mistress I'd photographed, the one Sarah had named through tears. And though bile rose in my throat at the thought of speaking to the woman who helped humiliate my daughter, I knew David was right. She might be the only one who could topple Robert's wall of lies. The following evening, I disguised myself in a ball cap and hoodie and slipped into a smoky dive bar on the edge of downtown, a place where whispers said Denise liked to drink, the jukebox playing country ballads while men nursed beers at the counter. And I sat at a shadowy booth waiting, my eyes glued to the door, until finally she walked in, heels clicking, red lipstick gleaming under the dim bulbs, her walk full of bravado, but her eyes betraying something hollow. I slid into the seat across from her before she could protest, setting a thick envelope on the table. And when she arched a brow and sneered, "And who the hell are you?" I answered simply, "The mother of the woman whose life you helped ruin." And before she could roll her eyes, I pushed the envelope closer. Inside, copies of the fraudulent deed Robert had filed, along with a printout of her debt-riddled credit report I'd quietly pulled through an old contact, showing overdue credit cards, a repossessed car, and a looming threat of foreclosure. And as she flipped through the pages, her smirk dissolved, her face draining of color. And I leaned in, my voice low and sharp. "Robert's not going to save you. He's going to drag you down with him. But if you testify to the truth, I'll make sure you walk out clean." And for a long minute, she sat frozen, her cocktail glass trembling in her manicured hand. Then she whispered, He told me he'd give me part of that land, that I'd finally have something to my name, and I cut her off. He lied to you like he lies to everyone. You're nothing to him but a pawn, and pawns get sacrificed first. And before she could respond, two of Robert's thugs shoved through the door, scanning the bar until their eyes landed on me. And they started toward our booth with menace in every step. But I pulled out my badge, slapped it on the table next to the envelope, and stared them down, my voice cold as steel. Try it, and you'll both be in cuffs before you finish your next breath. And they hesitated, exchanged a look, then retreated with curses under their breath, leaving Denise pale and shaken. And I leaned closer, telling her, "See? He can't even protect you in here. But I can if you do the right thing." And after a long silence, she finally nodded, whispering, "I'll testify. Just keep me safe." And in that moment, I felt the first real crack in Robert's armor, the beginning of the end. And as I walked back to my car, the cool night air brushing against my face, I knew the battlefield had shifted. Robert thought he had the town on his side, but now I had the one witness who could topple his lies, and with Denise ready to speak, his empire of threats and fraud would finally start to crumble. The morning of the hearing dawned heavy with gray clouds that seemed to press against the courthouse in downtown Columbus, as if the sky itself knew a storm was coming. And I rose before sunrise to prepare Sarah, heating broth in the kitchen while she still slept, the aroma of thyme and chicken filling the house as I tiptoed to her room with a tray, waking her gently with a whisper that today she didn't have to bow her head anymore. Today we would stand up and face him. Her eyes fluttered open, swollen still, but less so than a week ago, and I dressed her in a pale blue dress that brought out the softness of her features, wrapping a silk scarf around her neck to conceal the fading bruise along her collarbone, smoothing her hair back from her face while she stared at me in silence, tears welling but unshed, until she squeezed my hand and whispered, "I'm scared, Mom." And I cupped her cheek, answering, "So am I, honey, but we'll walk in there together and we'll walk out stronger." And when Captain Ross arrived with a patrol car escort, his jaw set with resolve, I felt a flicker of comfort that at least someone inside the system had my back. Outside, the streets were already buzzing with townsfolk gathered in clusters, whispering, pointing, some offering nods of support, others sneering with suspicion, the poison of Robert's rumors still alive in their throats. And as Sarah and I walked up the courthouse steps, their eyes followed us, judgment heavy like stones. But I straightened my shoulders, clutching Sarah's hand tight, determined to show them the face of a mother who would not bow to gossip. Inside the courtroom, the air was stale, wood benches creaking under the weight of curious neighbors, reporters scribbling notes, and at the far side I saw Robert in a tailored navy suit, his skin flush with arrogance, standing tall beside his high-powered attorney, Jonathan Pierce, a shark from Cleveland with a reputation for ripping victims apart on the stand. And behind them sat Denise, her arms folded, her face pale but resolved, a silent reminder that not everyone would bend to his control. Judge Allen, a stern man with decades on the bench, entered, his gavel striking like thunder as the room fell into silence, and David rose to present our case, his voice steady as he outlined the abuse, the threats, the fraud, placing each piece of evidence before the court with the precision of a surgeon, photos of Sarah's swollen eye and split lip, medical reports signed by Dr. Morales, the porch video from Mrs. Carter showing Sarah pounding on my door in the middle of the night, her voice cracking with pleas for help, the forged deed with Robert's fingerprints still smudged on the edges, and as the video played on the big screen, Sarah's sobs echoed through the room, piercing and raw. And I heard gasps ripple through the benches, some neighbors covering their mouths, others bowing their heads in shame for having doubted her. I glanced at Sarah beside me, her body trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks, and I reached out to place a firm hand on her shoulder, whispering, "You're safe now." Though my own throat burned from holding back fury, When Pierce rose for cross-examination, his words dripped with venom, calling Sarah's testimony fabricated, accusing me of abusing my badge to orchestrate a witch hunt, painting Robert as the victim of a manipulative mother-in-law. And though each lie was like acid poured over wounds that hadn't even begun to heal, David countered with calm precision, pointing to the threatening text messages Robert had sent, projected on the screen in bold letters, "Keep your mouth shut or you'll lose everything." And the room fell silent again, the weight of those words undeniable. Then came the moment that shifted the ground entirely. Denise took the stand, her hands shaking as she swore under oath, her eyes darting to Robert, who glared daggers at her. And in a trembling voice, she confessed that Robert had promised her a share of the stolen property if she helped push Sarah out, that he had orchestrated the forged deed, that he bragged openly about teaching Sarah a lesson whenever she resisted him, and when Robert erupted from his seat, shouting, "Liar! You betrayed me!" The bailiffs had to force him back down as Judge Allen thundered, "Order!" Denise's testimony poured like gasoline on the fire of truth, every word hammering the coffin nails into Robert's defense. And though a part of me hated her for standing by him so long, another part of me recognized the courage it took to speak against him now. And I silently willed her strength to hold. Finally, it was my turn to testify, and as I walked to the stand, I felt the eyes of the whole town drilling at me, but I lifted my chin, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, then turned to the judge with steady resolve, saying, "Your Honor, I am a police officer, but today I'm here as a mother who refuses to let her daughter be destroyed by a man who thinks violence is love and lies are law. Robert is no husband, no protector. He is an abuser, a fraud, and a coward who preys on those weaker than him. I will not let my daughter's cries be dismissed as gossip. Not now, not ever." And when I sat down again, I saw Sarah's face glisten with pride and pain, her hand slipping into mine, her grip tighter than I thought her small fingers capable of. After hours of testimony and rebuttals, Judge Allen leaned forward, his gavel poised, and in a voice that cut through the stale air, he delivered the ruling. Robert's assets frozen, the fraudulent deed annulled, a protective order issued for Sarah, and the case referred to the district attorney for criminal charges of domestic violence and fraud. His words rolling through the courtroom like a cleansing tide. And though the gavel struck finality, the moment seared in me was Robert slumping into his chair, his face drained of color, his bravado collapsing like a cheap mask. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers, some neighbors turning to look at me with new respect, others averting their eyes in shame. And as I guided Sarah out into the bright noon sun, the warmth of the light bathing us, I heard someone murmur, "Justice won today." And though relief coursed through me, I knew deep down this was not the end, but merely the first battle won in a long war to heal my daughter's body, her heart, and her spirit. The afternoon after Judge Allen's ruling should have felt like victory. But as Sarah and I walked down the courthouse steps into the September sun, with reporters shouting questions and townsfolk buzzing all around, what I felt wasn't triumph, but a strange, hollow relief. Like a weight had lifted, yet left bruises behind. Because even though Robert's assets were frozen and the fraudulent deed annulled, even though Sarah had a protective order and Denise's testimony had ripped his lies apart, I knew the scars on my daughter's body and soul would not vanish with a gavel strike, and that thought pressed heavier on me than any courtroom victory. By evening, word had spread like wildfire across Columbus. Robert's arrest warrant signed and officers sent to pick him up at his pawn shop. Neighbors crowding the sidewalks to watch the once proud man let out in handcuffs, his head lowered, his tailored suit swapped for orange jail scrubs in the front page photo of the Sunday Gazette, under the headline, "Pawn Shop Owner Charged with Domestic Violence and Fraud." And yet when I saw that picture the next morning, sipping cold coffee at my kitchen table, I didn't feel joy, only a quiet ache, because this was a man I had once trusted enough to give my daughter's hand to, someone I had shared Thanksgiving dinners with, who had called me mom with a smile that now looked like pure manipulation in retrospect. And realizing how blind I had been to his true nature gnawed at me like rust in my bones. Sarah, meanwhile, was restless those first few nights. Curled up on the pull-out sofa in my living room because she didn't want to be alone in a bedroom, waking up screaming from nightmares where she swore Robert was pounding on the door, shouting her name, and I would rush to her side, holding her trembling body, whispering, "It's over, honey. He can't touch you now." Though deep down I knew the shadows of trauma clung tighter than any restraining order could peel away. I called Dr. Elaine Brooks, the trauma counselor, and booked Sarah for weekly sessions, driving her every Tuesday afternoon to the little brick office that smelled of lavender, waiting in the lobby with my badge hidden under my jacket, reading the Bible or old magazines while my daughter poured her pain out to someone trained to help her sort through it. And week by week, I began to see small shifts. She no longer flinched at every knock on the door. She started to hum again while washing dishes. And one evening, I even caught her in the kitchen making mac and cheese from scratch, singing softly to herself. And the sound made my eyes sting because it was the first music in our home since that night she stumbled through my doorway bloody and broken. Still, not everyone in town was willing to see the truth, and as I walked through the grocery store aisles one Saturday, I overheard two women from church whispering that maybe Sarah had provoked him. Maybe she talked back too much. And though I wanted to turn and lash out, I kept walking, because I had learned that ignorance was another kind of violence, one that couldn't be fought with fists or files, but with resilience and time. Denise, for her part, disappeared from the local scene after the trial, word circulating that she had packed up and left town, maybe heading south to Kentucky or Tennessee to start over. And though part of me resented her for ever being involved with Robert, another part hoped she truly found a way to rebuild her life, because in the end, her testimony had helped save Sarah from further torment, and I couldn't deny that. Robert's two cronies, the ones who had lurked outside my house and tried to intimidate us, were arrested within days on charges of witness tampering, and their absence made the neighborhood breathe easier, children once again playing on the sidewalks without parents glancing over their shoulders. Though I remained vigilant, knowing that trauma doesn't disappear just because the source is behind bars. Sarah eventually moved permanently into my house, unpacking the last of her belongings from the apartment she once shared with Robert. And as we folded her clothes into drawers and stacked boxes in the attic, she whispered, "I don't even recognize that place anymore, Mom. It doesn't feel like it was ever mine." And I hugged her tightly, telling her, "Then let this be home, your safe place, until you find your wings again." Though part of me hoped she would never leave, that I could keep her safe under my roof forever, even knowing that wasn't fair to her future. The town's whispers eventually softened, neighbors who had once doubted beginning to cross the street to greet me again, some even offering sheepish apologies for having believed Robert's lies. And while I didn't hold grudges, I also didn't forget, because in the darkest nights it had been only Sarah, me, and Mrs. Carter fighting for survival, and I knew exactly who had stood by us when it mattered. At the precinct, I returned to patrols and paperwork, but I found myself drawn more and more to cases of domestic violence, sitting longer with victims, telling them quietly that they weren't alone, sharing glimpses of Sarah's struggle without naming her, hoping my words would give them courage to leave before it was too late. And sometimes when a young woman came into the station crying with her kids clinging to her side, I would sit beside her, hand her tissues, and whisper, "My daughter lived through this too. You will survive." And in those moments, I felt my badge wasn't just metal, but a promise to help. Weeks turned into months, fall leaves littering the streets, and one evening Sarah came home from a counseling session with a faint smile, saying she had applied for a bookkeeping job at a local insurance firm, her voice hesitant as though she feared I'd tell her it was too soon, but instead I clasped her hands and said, "That's wonderful, honey, you're ready." And the day she walked in with a crisp offer letter clutched to her chest, her eyes shining, I cried harder than I had even at the verdict, because seeing her reclaim a piece of her independence was the sweetest justice of all. Still, at night, I often sat on the porch alone, coffee cooling in my hands, replaying that first night she collapsed at my door, the blood on her lip, the terror in her voice, and wondering how many other mothers across America were living the same nightmare, silenced by fear or shame. And I knew then that our fight had to be more than personal. It had to be an example, a beacon, that violence might shatter lives, but truth and resilience could piece them back together. In those quiet hours, I prayed that Sarah would one day not just survive, but thrive, her laughter ringing louder than any memory of Robert's cruelty. And I promised myself that as long as breath remained in me, I would use my voice, my badge, and my story to protect her and every other woman who needed someone to stand beside them in the storm. Winter settled over Columbus with a biting chill, the kind that seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. And though the snow blanketed the streets in silence, inside my house, the echoes of Sarah's healing were slowly beginning to replace the memories of screams and sobs. Little things like her humming while folding laundry, her laughter flickering back in short bursts whenever Mrs. Carter dropped by with fresh cornbread, and her eyes finally meeting neighbors' gazes without dropping to the ground in shame. But the nightmares still lingered, waking her in the middle of the night with shrieks that sent me running down the hall, where I'd sit on the edge of her bed and hold her until the shaking subsided, whispering over and over, "He can't hurt you anymore," even as my own mind replayed Robert's sneer in the pawn shop, his voice saying Sarah was weak and deserved correction, words that haunted me almost as much as his fists haunted her. Therapy helped, Dr. Brooks slowly guiding Sarah to reclaim her confidence, and by February, she was strong enough to start her new bookkeeping job at Hartwell Insurance downtown, walking into that office with her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, and the day she brought home her first paycheck, she laid it on the kitchen counter with a smile that lit up our small home brighter than any Christmas tree had in years, whispering, "I'm doing it, Mom, I'm really doing it." And I hugged her so tightly she laughed and told me I was crushing her. And for a fleeting moment, the house felt light again, filled not with fear, but with possibility. Yet, even as Sarah rebuilt her life, Robert's shadow loomed over us from the county jail, his attorney Pierce filing appeal after appeal, twisting every legal loophole to stall proceedings. And though the DA had him pinned with charges of domestic violence, fraud, and witness intimidation, Pierce painted him as a family man wronged by vindictive in-laws. And the whispers crept back into grocery store aisles and church pews, some townsfolk muttering that maybe he'd been framed, maybe the whole thing was blown out of proportion. And while I wanted to shout the truth in their faces, I held my tongue because I knew the evidence spoke louder than my anger ever could. Meanwhile, Sarah received threatening letters with no return address, crude scribbles warning her to drop it or else. And though Captain Ross traced them back to one of Robert's cronies who'd avoided the first sweep, the reality was clear. Robert's reach, even from behind bars, still clawed at us. And each envelope was another weight on Sarah's fragile progress, another reason for me to double lock the doors at night and keep my service pistol within arm's reach. One Sunday evening, as I sat on the porch sipping coffee while Sarah baked in the kitchen, Mrs. Carter joined me with her ever-present broom and muttered, "Mary, I've lived in this town 60 years and I've never seen a man spin lies so fast. Be careful, some folks still believe him." And I nodded, because I had seen it too, the way gossip outpaced truth. But then she added, "But I've also never seen a mother fight as hard as you, and don't you dare forget you've got allies." And her words steadied me like a hand on my back. When spring came, Sarah's resilience blossomed with it. She began volunteering at a local women's shelter on weekends, quietly sharing her story with others who came in with bruises hidden under long sleeves. And though she didn't tell them every detail, the way she looked them in the eye and said, "You're not alone," was enough to make some of them break down and cling to her. And each time she came home from the shelter, she looked both drained and stronger, like giving her pain away piece by piece made room for something new to grow. But as Robert's trial date for the criminal charges drew closer in May, the pressure mounted. Pierce doubling down in the press, feeding reporters a narrative that I was a corrupt cop using my badge to settle family grudges. And though the Gazette largely ignored him, a few out-of-town papers picked it up, running headlines that questioned whether small-town justice was fair when police families were involved. And Sarah cried when she saw them, convinced the world would never see her as a victim, but a liar. And I held her close, promising that when she took the stand again, the truth would cut through all the noise. The night before trial, I found another envelope shoved under the door, this one containing only a photo of Sarah walking to her car after work circled in red ink. And though my blood ran cold, I shoved it into the evidence folder, then spent the entire night awake at the dining table, pistol on the wood, watching the window blind shift in the breeze, ready to kill if anyone dared come near her. Because by then, I knew this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival, about proving to Robert and anyone who stood with him that we were not afraid. When the trial began, The courtroom filled once again, the same old benches groaning under the weight of curiosity. But this time, there was less snickering, less doubt in the eyes watching us, because the last months had chipped away at Robert's myth of respectability, and people had started to see the cracks. The DA laid out the case with brutal clarity, stacking evidence like bricks, the photos of Sarah's battered body, the medical scans showing contusions, Denise's signed affidavit confirming the fraud, the threatening texts and anonymous letters traced back to Robert's cronies, and then Sarah herself took the stand. Her voice trembling at first as she described the night he shoved her into a wall because she asked about his affair, the way he tightened his grip around her wrists until she thought bones might snap, the threats he hissed about ruining her if she spoke. And though she broke down in tears halfway through, the silence in the courtroom was thick with something undeniable, truth, and even Pierce couldn't twist it into something else. When it was my turn to testify again, I stared Robert down across the room, his eyes cold and venomous, and said clearly that I had raised my daughter to believe in the law, not violence, that I had served as a police officer for 20 years without ever abusing my authority, and that if the court believed Robert's lies over the mountain of evidence, then no woman in our county was safe. And I could see Judge Allen's eyes soften with recognition that this case was bigger than just one family. It was about precedent, about sending a message. After 2 weeks of testimony, deliberations took less than a day, and when the jury filed back in, the foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts, including domestic violence, fraud, and witness intimidation. And Sarah sobbed into my arms while Robert cursed and thrashed as bailiffs restrained him, his once perfect suit wrinkled, his once smug face pale with rage. And though I felt no joy, I felt justice, solid and heavy, like a door slamming shut on the nightmare we had lived through. That night, back on our porch, Sarah curled against me under a quilt while crickets sang in the humid air, and for the first time in months, she whispered, "Mom, I think I can breathe again." And I kissed her hair, whispering back, "That's all I ever wanted." Summer rolled into Ohio with sticky heat that clung to the skin, and though Robert was now locked away in a state penitentiary after being found guilty on all counts, his presence still lingered like a ghost in every shadow, a reminder of how much damage one man's cruelty could do. And as Sarah and I tried to stitch our lives back together, the town slowly shifted too. People who had once doubted us beginning to smile again at the grocery store, some even offering awkward apologies in church pews. Though I accepted them without resentment because I knew ignorance had been Robert's greatest weapon and silence his shield. But even as the outside world softened, inside our house, the process of healing was anything but simple. Sarah would sit at the kitchen table some nights staring at nothing, her hand gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then suddenly she'd whisper things she had never told me before, like how Robert used to threaten to burn her clothes if she left the house without his permission, or how he'd take her phone and scroll through her messages accusing her of affairs she never had. And each confession sliced through me like barbed wire because I realized how much she had carried alone, too ashamed to call her mother even though she knew I was only a mile away. Dr. Brooks encouraged her to release it all, to purge the poison from her memory. And though those conversations were brutal, each one seemed to make Sarah stand a little taller afterward, her laughter returning in small bursts, her cheeks gaining color. And by July, she even began cooking again, inviting Mrs. Carter and me to sit at the table while she experimented with recipes she had clipped from magazines, laughing when she burnt a casserole and vowing to master it next time. And in those moments, I saw glimpses of the daughter I thought I had lost forever. Meanwhile, I found myself more committed than ever to my badge, pouring extra hours into domestic violence cases, speaking to women at the shelter Sarah volunteered at, telling them plainly that silence only strengthens abusers, and that if they needed someone to walk with them into court, I'd be there, not as a cop, but as a mother who knew the cost of staying quiet. And sometimes those women would hug me with tears in their eyes, whispering, "Thank you," in voices cracked with fear. And I knew that the hell we had endured was beginning to mean something larger than just survival. Still, reminders of Robert's reach slipped through, like the day Sarah came home from work trembling with a letter from the Department of Corrections, a generic notification that he had filed yet another appeal. And though the DA assured us it was routine and unlikely to succeed, the effect on Sarah was immediate. Her hands shaking, her breathing shallow, and I spent the night sitting beside her bed until she finally slept, hating that a single piece of paper could undo months of progress. But also realizing that healing wasn't linear. It was a constant battle, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. One weekend in August, I suggested we drive to Lake Erie for a change of scenery, packing a cooler with sandwiches and watermelon. And when Sarah dipped her toes into the cool water, laughing as the waves lapped at her ankles, I snapped a picture with my phone because it felt like proof that joy still lived in her. And she teased me for being sentimental, but later that evening, as we watched the sunset paint the horizon in pink and orange, she whispered, "For the first time in so long, I feel free." And tears streamed down my face because those words were worth every sleepless night, every courtroom battle, every ounce of rage I had swallowed to let justice work. Back in Columbus, the community began to view us differently, inviting Sarah to speak at church gatherings and town halls about her experience. And though she was nervous, her voice shook only slightly as she stood before a crowd of neighbors saying, "If you hear cries behind closed doors, don't assume it's nothing. Speak up, because silence almost killed me." And afterward, women lined up to thank her, some confessing their own secrets, and I stood in the back watching with a pride so fierce it ached, knowing my daughter had transformed from victim to advocate. At home, I still wrestled with my own demons, sitting on the porch at night, staring into the dark, replaying every decision I had made, wondering if I could have saved Sarah sooner had I noticed the signs. And though she assured me again and again it wasn't my fault, that Robert's violence was his choice, not my failure, the guilt never fully left. It simply lived beside my resolve to ensure no other mother in my precinct ever felt the same. As September approached, marking a year since that night Sarah collapsed at my door, I planned a quiet dinner, just the two of us and Mrs. Carter. Nothing fancy, but enough to mark how far we had come. And when Sarah sat across the table with her hair pulled back, her smile soft but real, I raised a glass of iced tea and said, "To survival, to justice, and to new beginnings." And she clinked her glass to mine with tears in her eyes, whispering, "To you, Mom, for never giving up on me." And though my throat closed with emotion, I swallowed it down and smiled, because in that moment I realized we had already won. Not just in court, but in reclaiming the pieces of life Robert had tried to steal, and no appeal, no rumor, no ghost of his cruelty could ever erase that. By the time autumn leaves began to scatter across the streets of Columbus, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of wood smoke, Sarah and I had built a new rhythm of life, one that still carried scars but also glimmers of peace. Mornings where she brewed coffee before I came back from patrol, evenings when she came home from her bookkeeping job and filled the kitchen with chatter about clients and coworkers instead of silence and fear. And though nightmares still sometimes gripped her, jolting her awake in cold sweats, they were less frequent, and each time I rushed into her room, she would manage to steady her breathing faster, whispering, "I know he can't reach me now," as though she was learning to convince herself along with me, and that alone felt like progress. Mrs. Carter remained a constant presence, dropping by with pies, keeping a motherly eye on Sarah, and one chilly Saturday she told me with a firm look, "Mary, you didn't just save your daughter, you reminded this whole town what justice looks like." And though I tried to brush it off, a warmth spread in my chest because I realized she was right. People had begun to look at us differently, not with pity, but with respect. Some even asking me to speak at the county fair about women's safety, others inviting Sarah to share her story at church, and together we found ourselves turning our private pain into something public and powerful. The Gazette eventually ran a long feature titled "From Silence to Strength: A Mother and Daughter's Fight for Justice." printing our photos alongside details of Robert's conviction, and though Sarah blushed furiously seeing her name in print, she admitted later that she was proud that maybe her story could save someone else from staying too long in the shadows. In the background, Robert continued filing motions from his prison cell, his attorney Pierce dragging out every possible appeal, but each was denied, and every denial felt like another nail sealing the coffin of his influence. Until, one day, a guard from the penitentiary called the DA's office to report that Robert had been jumped in the yard after mouthing off to the wrong inmate, and though part of me felt grim satisfaction, another part only felt empty. Because in the end, men like him always destroy themselves, and the only real victory was Sarah's survival. Months later, Sarah was promoted at work to lead bookkeeper, and I watched her walk into the house with flowers in her hand and a grin on her face, saying, "I did it, Mom!" And we hugged and laughed, and it was a moment so ordinary, so simple, that tears streamed down my face because ordinary was something I once thought we'd never get back. As winter rolled around again, nearly a full year since the nightmare began, we'd decorate the house with string lights, Sarah humming carols while she baked gingerbread cookies. And on Christmas Eve, we invited Mrs. Carter and a few trusted neighbors over for dinner, the smell of roast turkey filling the air, laughter echoing off the walls, and I stood in the kitchen doorway watching Sarah smile freely, watching her pass plates and tell jokes, and I thought to myself, this is victory. This right here, not a gavel strike or a headline, but the return of laughter to a house that once held nothing but sobs. Later that night, when the guests were gone and Sarah had gone to bed, I sat alone on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, the night sky sharp with stars, and I let myself remember that first night, the pounding on the door, Sarah collapsing into my arms, the blood on her lip, the terror in her eyes, and I compared it to now. The steady sound of her breathing drifting down the hall, the quiet of a house finally at peace. And though I knew scars never vanish completely, I also knew healing was real, that we had walked through fire and come out on the other side. I whispered a prayer into the cold air, thanking God for giving me the strength to fight, for giving Sarah the courage to speak, and for reminding us both that even in the darkest corners, light finds a way. And then, almost unconsciously, I found myself wondering about the women still trapped in silence, the mothers who hadn't yet heard that they had the power to fight back. And I promised myself right then that I would not stop with Sarah. I would keep working every case, keep walking into every shelter, keep standing beside every woman who needed someone to believe her. Because our story wasn't just survival. It was a call, a reminder that truth matters, that justice is possible, and that even when betrayal comes from inside your own family, courage can turn the tide. When I finally rose to head inside, I glanced once more at the glowing Christmas lights on our porch, their colors bright against the dark. And I smiled because for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And so was my daughter. And together we were writing a new story, one not of pain, but of strength. One that no man, no rumor, no threat could ever take from us again.